If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Jacob. I'm the youth pastor here on staff, and we're going to be talking out of Philippians chapter 1 this morning, mostly verses 27 through 30. So you can go ahead and turn there, or go there in your app. But I woke up this morning feeling pretty thankful for the opportunity to preach this morning. I didn't know till a little bit later than normal, just because of what happened to Pastor Carey. And that had a little bit of nerves, but I'm mostly thankful. I'm thankful for a pastor who's not going to destroy me when I drop my notes and have to stall for 2 minutes, or if I say something silly. I'm thankful for you guys for being willing to listen, and those of you as well who have joined online. But I'm thankful really in just such a chaotic time that we're living in. We say this, and sometimes I think we don't really think about what it means, or we just say it just to say it, but God is in control. He has all things in his hand. But it really is. It's an insane time to be alive. Some of you remember a time in our country where things weren't so divided. I remember asking the staff, when was the last time somebody ran for president that pretty much everybody supported? And we want that guy to represent us. And it's not like that today. I don't know that it's been like that in my life, at least not since I was old enough to remember who was running for different things. But it's so divided in today's world. We came together when the fly landed on the vice president's head. At least Twitter did. We were laughing. We had a good time. But then as soon as the fly takes off, nothing was funny anymore, and it was back to the fighting and the division. We're literally divided right now because of the ongoing pandemic. You don't get close to anyone you don't live with. Some days students are in school. Some days they're out of school. Things get canceled at the very last minute. Plans have to change. And if you're what I would consider one of the unlucky ones, you may get the phone call. You were in close contact with someone who tested positive, and you have to quarantine. I had to do that a couple weeks ago. Had to quarantine, and to be honest with you, I kind of felt like I was in prison. At least if I was in one of the soft ones where you still get the TV, because I definitely had that. But I was stuck, and I couldn't go anywhere, and it was a really tough time. And then I was thinking the Apostle Paul, in Philippians especially, he could relate to that. He could relate to being in prison. When he wrote this letter to the Philippian church, he was in prison. Now, we're not going to read the whole book of Philippians. Like I said, we're going to focus on verses 27 through 30. But you should. It's a letter of joy, of encouragement from a guy who's in prison. He talks about how, in the verses prior to what we're going to focus on, how his imprisonment helped him advance the gospel. But then he says in verse 21, to live is Christ and to die is gain. But there's tension there. He wants nothing more than to leave the broken world that we live in and be with Christ forever. But he understands, according to what he writes to us in verses 22 through 26, that it's better for him to still be on earth. It's better for him to be on earth ministering to people so they may grow in their faith. That's how he describes it. He understands that even though things are hard, and they're really hard, especially for him, he has a job to do. He has people to minister to. Now, I'm going to say it now, and I'll say it again later, but in no way, shape, or form am I comparing the chaos that we have in America right now to what was going on with the Philippian church or what was going on with Paul. We also face nothing like our Christian brothers and sisters across the world. They're seeing a lot different persecution and things like that than we are. We complain about wearing a mask sometimes, but really that's not persecution at all. However, all that being said, the Christian worldview is under attack in our culture today. It has been for some time. We just came off a series, Upside Down, taught many ways in which things are twisted, and the world views them as upside down, but with Christ we can view them as they should be, right side up, because Christ changes everything. It impacts everything in every way that we live. So whether you wind up in prison for sharing your faith, or you struggle to remember if it's the white side or the blue side that goes out on the mask, or if you don't know who you should vote for, what Paul writes in Philippians 1:27 applies across the board. Let's read it. Paul says this, just one thing. As citizens of heaven, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. So what does it mean for something to be worthy? Just generically speaking, what does it mean for them to be worthy? It's this idea of measurement. A worker is worth his or her wages or if they're worthy of his or her wages, it means that the work they put in measures up to the amount of money that they receive. Or you can think about it this way. If the amount of fun you have on the roller coaster is worth the hour and a half wait in line, then it's worthy of your time. You've been there. Who likes roller coasters? Anybody? I love roller coasters. You wait a long time in line sometimes. You ride it. You get off, your hair's a mess sometimes. Some of us don't have that problem. But you say, it was worth it. It was worth it. That ride was worthy of your time because in your mind, everything measured up. So if we're going to call ourselves believers, call ourselves Christians, then to live your life worthy of the gospel is to carry out in conduct that which you proclaim in word. To live your life worthy of the gospel is to carry out in conduct that which you proclaim in word. But here we run into what could be a problem. We're called to live our life worthy of the gospel of Christ because we're what Paul calls citizens of heaven. We have to address that, a citizen of heaven. The word translated live your life, or your Bible may say something like conduct yourselves, is a very political word. But Paul says it here and later on in the letter to the Philippians that our citizenship lies with heaven. And you may read that and you go, yeah, of course. Of course our citizenship is in heaven. We talk about that a lot. But if you really think about what that means, we may start having some confliction, some tension in our lives. The church in Philippi certainly would have. What you may not know about them is they were a Roman colony. And in some sense, in a lot of ways, they were Romans. And they were proud to be Roman. Really, really proud to be Roman. They would have prized the customs and the culture that it was to be Roman. And we kind of do that here in America. We're proud to be American. But here's the thing. Civilizations, like I said, have rules and customs. And the kingdom of heaven is no different. So here's where we may have a problem if the two don't match up. And I'm going to be honest, they don't. All right? The rules don't and the customs don't match up. If you were to find yourself, let's just say, in a culture that says you should serve first yourself and your desires and do whatever it takes to climb to the top of the social food chain or the economic food chain, even if you have to maybe step on the backs of other people, then that's not going to line up with what we live by in the kingdom of heaven, this idea of love God and then love your neighbor. Because typically when we're going to love God and love our neighbor, it means a life of sacrifice and a life of servanthood. Paul was reminding the Philippian church of that when he wrote them this letter, and that's something he's reminding us of today. And then we were laughing. I was talking about this with Pastor Kerry. He says just one thing, but then there's like a few steps on how to do it. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to. Look back with me at verse 27. We're going to read the whole verse this time. We just read part of it last time. It says, just one thing. As citizens of heaven, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear about you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, in one accord, contending together for the faith of the gospel. Paul's first point here is that we must be unified. We must be unified. As a church, as a body of believers, we must be unified. He uses two metaphors in this text. You may not see them right off the bat, but the first one is Paul paints a military image when he says to stand firm. It's a tactical thing, right? If everyone forms together and gets in their position, then they can work together. They can stand firm against whatever the opponent may have to throw at them. Many of you have probably heard about the Spartans. Spartan warriors were really, really good at this. The way they would form and make this sort of pod with the guy holding the shield, the guy behind him with the spear, and usually there was guys behind him holding them up just in case things got a little sideways. But there's this battle of Thermopylae, the 300. The thing about this, spoiler, I don't know if you watched the movie or just read the story or whatever, but they actually lose the battle. And I thought about how does someone who is so good at standing firm, so good at holding their position, how do they lose? Well, if you know the historical accounts, a fellow Greek actually sold them out. They had their position where the Persian army that they were going against would have to funnel to them, and they would be able to destroy them no problem, even though they were outnumbered. But a fellow Greek told the Persians about a path that shepherds use. And the Persians used it, and they snuck all the way around, and they surrounded the Spartans. And the way they form up doesn't work if you're surrounded. But it didn't work because someone else sold them out. It's a shame when that happens in churches. It's a shame when we're divided on the inside. We're going to talk about this on Wednesday with our junior high students. But Jesus said this in Matthew 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Standing firm in one accord, united, is of the utmost importance if we're to do what Paul's saying here, if we're to be unified. But he shifts to a different image. He mentions contending together for the faith of the gospel. This is a picture of athletics, a team working together to win, to achieve a common goal. It's no secret if you follow me on any sort of social media that I'm a Dallas Stars hockey fan. I'm a United States hockey fan, a big fan of the sport, and I never played it, but it's fantastic. But I think about the movie Miracle. Some of you have probably seen it. Some of you probably remember the real story, the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. Just a bunch of college guys that have to come together to play against powerhouses like Sweden and Finland and the dreaded Soviet Union. Now, I've seen the movie. I watch it a lot. And in the movie, these guys who are normally rivals, they play for colleges who don't like each other. They have to come together to represent their country. The problem is they fall back to the old ways, like when they're playing for their college teams. The movie shows they fight at practice. Now, some of you think, that's hockey. You may be thinking, when I watch hockey, I watch it for the fights. That's the only reason I'm going to watch the sport, is for the fighting. The difference is, in hockey, you typically don't fight your own team. Like if you're fighting your own team, there's a problem. In the movie, Coach Herb Brooks starts yelling. He says, does this look like hockey to you? And they kind of stop. They separate them and they stop. And he goes into how they have to come together as a team. And he suggests they introduce themselves. And it goes something like this. The first player speaks up. He actually was in the fight. He says, Rob McClanahan, St. Paul, Minnesota. Coach asks him, who do you play for? He says, I play for you here at the U, the University of Minnesota. Next player speaks up. Jack O'Callahan, Charlestown, Mass. Boston University. Around they go. And you think maybe they're starting to figure it out. The problem is they're still not playing like a team. They went around, they introduced themselves. They're not playing like a team. They go out, they play a terrible game. Fans are leaving the arena, and he puts them on the line. They're going to skate line drills after their game because they weren't playing like a team. They skate one. Again. They skate another one. Again. 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 He yells at them. The name on the front of your jersey is more important than the name on the back. So he tells them, again. And they keep skating. And they keep skating. The team doctor says, Coach, someone's going to get hurt. But he just ignores it. Again. And then finally, they're skating, and they're skating, and a player short of breath speaks up right before they have to go again. And he says, Mike Urizzoni, Winthrop, Massachusetts. Coach looks at him, and he says, who do you play for? He says, I play for the United States of America. It's a huge moment in the movie. Maybe they've come together as a team. And you may be thinking, what on earth does that have to do with this lesson? Here's my point. Unity does not have to mean uniformity. To be working together for the same goal doesn't mean everyone does the exact same job. They don't even think the exact same way. The goalie thinks differently than a forward. The defensemen have their job, and the coaches have theirs. The guys on this Olympic team, they all have different names. They all come from different schools. When they're not on the same team, they don't like each other. But imagine the guys that were fighting. Imagine instead of McClanahan and O'Callahan, imagine it says like Republican on one and Democrat on the other. They play under different systems for different coaches. But when they came together and realized the common goal, they contended together to defeat the Soviets. Right? And then they go on and they win the gold medal. And then the famous quote, do you believe in miracles? In the same way, believers are to set aside their differences, even political opinions, to contend together for for the faith of the gospel. Why is it so important that we're unified? Because if we're not, then no one's going to believe what we say we're fighting for. If we can't stand together, then they're not going to want what we have to offer. But Paul goes on. There's more to it than just being unified. To live worthy of the gospel of Christ, we must be unified, but Paul also adds that we must not be afraid. Look at verse 28. It says, not being frightened in any way by your opponents. This is a sign of destruction for them, but of your salvation. And this is from God. I want to think about some guys who are fearless. There's plenty of examples in the Bible, but here's a few. I think about a guy like Peter. Now, Peter has his problems. He falls short often. He makes mistakes, and you would say he's not very fearless when he's asked if he's one of Jesus' disciples, and 3 times he denies him. But that same Peter stands before many people and preaches the gospel boldly at Pentecost. And he doesn't stop there, and he keeps preaching, and he keeps going, and eventually it costs him his life under Emperor Nero. I think about Stephen. He's accused of blasphemy for the work that he does for the sake of the gospel, and he's given a chance to defend himself. But instead of defending himself, he just shares the gospel some more. In a way, that was his defense. These things are true, and he gives this beautiful account of the gospel. Why are these guys able to do this? It's because of power they had from God, the power they had from the Spirit. The Spirit falls at Pentecost, and Peter preaches this sermon. Acts 6 says Stephen was full of grace and power. When you give your life to Jesus, you have that power to be fearless. Here's another way of thinking about it. If you're with Christ and you're fighting for the sake of the gospel, then those who oppose you are actually opposing God because you're standing with him. Do not be afraid. It's one of the most common commands in the Bible. And you think, well, Peter died, and so did Stephen. Let me give you another story. This is 1 Samuel 17, and you're going to know it as soon as I start reading. In verse 41, the Philistine, you may know him as Goliath, came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? And then he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today, the Lord will hand you over to me. Today, I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. That type of fearlessness only comes from the Spirit. Our ability to be bold only comes from the power of God. So we need to be unified. We need to be fearless. And it kind of builds up to this in a way. We need to be fearless because the reality is that persecution and suffering will come. Look with me, verses 29 and 30. For it has been granted to you on Christ's behalf, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you were engaged in the same struggle that you saw I had, and now hear that I have. The point is this: we must be prepared to suffer. Now, the world we live in is broken. It's pretty evident when you look around you, when you turn on the TV, things like that. So to an extent, all of the earth suffers. When sin entered into the world, things got messed up. But notice this. Here, what Paul's talking about, let me read verse 29 again. For it has been granted to you on Christ's behalf, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. The suffering we're talking about here is things we face, persecution we face, suffering we have on behalf of Christ or for the sake of the gospel. Since the time of Christ, people have been persecuted for following him. We talked about Peter, who got killed under Nero. Stephen was stoned for what he said there in Acts. We shouldn't be surprised. Jesus told us this would happen. Look at John chapter 15, starting in verse 18. If the world hates you, understand that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. However, because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of it, the world hates you. Remember the word I spoke to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But they will do all these things to you on account of my name, because they don't know the one who sent me. Now, I want to be clear again, like I said earlier, the persecution we face is nothing compared to what people around the world are facing. We live in a free country where we can believe what we want to believe and we can worship freely. But there are times where you can be attacked for your beliefs. You can be ostracized for your beliefs. Some examples that I've seen from people that I went to churches with and have been surrounded by in my own life, someone who leaves or gives up a lucrative business career because they go work for a nonprofit. They could have been making six figures and now they're working paycheck to paycheck. Those types of things. They give that up for the sake of the gospel. They want to serve people, so they give up all of that money and all that they could have had for the sake of the gospel. I know a family who sold a car to go on a mission trip. And you may think, well, that's awesome. If you don't believe in spreading the gospel to the world, then you look at them like they're insane. Students talk about the reason they don't share their faith is because they're afraid of what their friends might think. That's the kind of thing that we face here a lot of times. And we have to be prepared for that, like Jesus said. But I want to clear something else up. It's a misconception on suffering. And it's this: suffering is not good. Suffering is not good. One of the first series I did with students, we talked about how it's not supposed to be this way. Suffering is a result of sin. Not necessarily of sin in your own life, but of the fall of man. Sin entered the world, and now things aren't right. Now we suffer. Now the Bible's clear that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to this purpose. God can make good out of the bad suffering. But suffering's not good. However, at the same time, it's Paul's suffering and Paul's imprisonment that leads to the letter to the Philippian church. And it's Christ's suffering on the cross that opens Paul's eyes to begin with. When Jesus talks to Paul on the road to Damascus, it was the suffering of Christ that enables you and me to become followers of Jesus. It's so crazy to think that God can take that bad and work it for our good. So with that in mind, let us be unified, let us be fearless, and let us suffer on behalf of Christ, because we just have just one thing. As citizens of heaven, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. Let's pray. God, I thank you that none of these things take you by surprise. And then when we have what seems to be our world falling apart at times, God, you're in control. And God, you don't waste our suffering. God, if we suffer on behalf of you, you can work good out of that. And we long for the day when things aren't like this anymore. And God, I pray for anyone in this room who maybe hasn't experienced the peace that can come with suffering on your behalf. Someone who hasn't experienced your love and your grace and your mercy. Because when I say Christ's suffering helped Paul and it helped me, it could help them too. God, but I pray they don't enter that decision lightly, that they know that things can be hard, things can be tough, but you gave us the church, God, to stand together, to stand firm in one accord so that we can stand for the truth and teach others about you. And God, I pray that we, as Farmington First, get better and better at loving you and loving people, because then we can make an impact on those around us. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.